I'm Ed McCord. I'm the director of the Sigur Center for Asian Studies. Today we're sponsoring this event along with the Institute for Communitarian Policy Studies. Very happy to see you all here, and I hope the room stays cooler than the outside as we continue on. Basic concept for this, or the basic background, I guess, for today's event is really the rise of China, and in particular the military rise of China and how the United States responds to that. And really the kind of inspiration for having this event was an article published by Professor Etzioni in the Yale Journal of International Affairs, which deals with this issue. And it's really a kind of classic issue, the issue that you want to, every country has to face potential challenges, but how in some ways do you not, the planning for those challenges end up creating the very conditions you're trying to avoid? How do you prevent the plans from turning into war? So this is really the issue we're dealing with. And we have three excellent presenters with us today to kind of debate some of these issues. First of all, Professor Amitai Etzioni from George Washington University. He's a university professor at the university. He's also a professor of international affairs. He's also the director of the Institute for Communitarian Policy Studies. Long academic background, 20-plus books. I wanted to plug his most recent book, Hot Spots. The first chapter in particular deals with the topic that we're talking about today. Our second presenter will be Ambassador Stapleton Roy, who spent 45 years in the Foreign Service and served as ambassador in Singapore and in China and in Indonesia, and is now director of the Kissinger Institute on China in the United States and the Woodrow Wilson Center. And then finally we have T.X. Hamas, who's currently, actually 30 years in the Marine Corps first, I shouldn't forget that. We have some practical aspect aside of this, but also some education in the Naval Academy and also at Oxford University, and is currently a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies. So without further ado, I will turn the podium over to Professor Etzioni. We'll have presentations by each of our speakers, then we'll come back and I hope have lots of time for questions and answers and discussion.
Thank you very, very much. What I hope will happen as a result of this meeting is that we'll help nurture a conversation on exactly the kind of issues Professor McCord just raised. Because at least as far as I can see, there are not many more important decisions than the United States relationship to China. Here we have two nations, each faces enormously challenging domestic problems. And there's a serious risk that their attention and resources will be diverted away from what President Obama called nation building at home, and instead to some kind of arms race, which at best will end up with the arms not being used, and at worst, of course, will lead to a fairly nasty total war. The question about the United States relation to China is often put between two bookends. On the one hand, there are those who argue that whenever an old power, that's the United States in case you didn't know, and a new one rises like China, it's inevitable, an iron law of history, that they will come to blows as the declining power will not yield quickly enough to the rising power. And if you accept that scenario, then preparing for war is indeed eminently sensible. I can't leave that standing long enough without saying there ain't no iron laws in history, so that's enough for that particular bookend. At the other extreme end of the spectrum, there are people like Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger who talk about G2, by which they mean that the United States and China will between them run the world and everybody else can go to G8. And I don't think that's extremely likely to happen either. But where we are between these two bookends is a much more challenging question than to poke a little fun at these two extremes. Within that question is a second question, particularly relevant to our discussion today. Because I suggested to you that we should use the air-sea battle as kind of the wedge to promote this bigger dialogue, because it raises the additional question, what will be the role of the military? What will be the role of coercive force in this larger strategy? And then there's a third issue, which I'll come back to later, is who's going to make that decision? What is our strategy and what role the military will have? Now, I think there are maybe some people in the room who are not familiar with what the ACB stands for, the LC battle, and you should not feel badly about that, because you have several 100 million Americans who are in the same place where you are. If you Google it, it's one of the less popular items, and it's surprisingly little known. We know we had 3 months intensive debates in private and in public whether we should send X more thousand soldiers to Afghanistan, the surge. 3 months, 15 minutes in the White House and its State Department, and its public discussions. We have a fairly decent debate, so there's always room for more. What we're going to do about Iran's nuclear weapon. But when it comes to the air sea battle, we have a surprisingly little awareness of it, let alone discussion. Now, what is that thing I'm talking about? There's not even agreement exactly what it is. You hear some people call it a concept, some people call it a plan, everybody swears it's not a strategy. I'm sorry, I beg to differ. I don't care what you call it. You can call it a flying zoo, for all I care. But it has a goal, and here and there it's stated in writing, and that is make the United States military so strong that China wouldn't even consider going to an armed conflict with us. That's a fairly clear goal. And there's a strategy. And I'd like to read you something, what that entails. The story starts with something you can live many happy years without knowing about it, known as area denial and access denial. And so the basic storyline starts with this issue that we used to govern the 7 seas, and our aircraft carriers and our boats could go any place and secure the freedom of navigation and protect Taiwan. And if we wanted to, those pile of rocks, Japan claims it belongs to Japan. And nobody could stop us. And then China developed a array of weapons, most obviously anti-ship missiles, which make our aircraft carriers, forgive me for plain English, sitting ducks. And so the response has been, the essence of the strategy we're talking about, the ACB, is that we have to be able to neutralize those anti-access weapons so we can again live up to our international obligations and our specific obligation in the area. And how are we going to do that? And that's, I want to read you a little passage, especially if I can find it. Okay. Starts with the blinding attack on the Chinese mainland, which involves neutralizing their radar system, their anti-missile systems, and their cyber capacity. It then destroys their anti-missile defenses, all involving a direct attack on China's mainland. The response seems to me very predictable. In effect, as you hear later, there are people who very serious, people I respect a great deal, who say that this is too aggressive because it could lead very quickly to a nuclear war, and therefore we should engage in a more moderate strategy of imposing a blockade on China. Now, ladies and gentlemen, would you put yourself just for 30 seconds into the shoes of a Chinese strategist? And you hear that the debate in the Pentagon and in our military circles is between those people who want to attack the mainland with full might in order to, again, secure our free access. And there are other people who are moderate and say, well, no, all we're going to do is blockade China to prevent them from getting the energy and the raw material on which their economy rests. What would be your reaction? That's what some of us are concerned about. but that invites, I think, obviously, armed mobilization on the other side, which then people correctly point to and say we need to respond to that. Now, to be fair here and accurate, the phrase I keep hearing from my colleagues at the Pentagon, that they're walking back this concept. And I'd like to explain it. In the first statements about ASB, they were unmistakably aimed at China, and they talked openly about what I just very briefly outlined. That created a certain amount of criticism from people as major Australian strategists, Hugo White, and by many others, you hear more about it later, I'm sure, who raised concerns about where this is taking us. So we are now no longer talking about anything to do with China. I'm told that this is a word you should not mention even in the cafeteria in the Pentagon. What we're talking about now, this is good for any place in the 5 seas, 7 seas, I'm sorry. I mean, you could use it against New Zealand or Estonia, any place. Well, but there are really only one major power which developed anti-access, anti-area denial weapons, and Iran is some far down the road, and that's about it. So for a while I thought I should stop mentioning what it's really all about, because it might be a really good idea kind of to lower the heat and stop provoking China. But then it hit me, the Chinese can read English. So if we not come forward and tell you what it's all about, the only one people are going to be fooled are our own citizens. So let's call it what it is. It's aimed first, second, and third against China, with some additional effect on Iran. It entails not just a concept. It's not just, I grant you, there should be a contingency file in the Pentagon for every possible eventuality, including, I guess, an attack by the Martians. But we're not talking just about a paper file or computer file. We're talking about reallocation of resources. If you look at the Congressional Research Service, a very respectable, non-partisan research body, you'll see the details of what the Navy wants to buy for the ASB plan. And again, true, to be fair, many of these things can also be used for other military purposes. But nevertheless, according to the Congressional Research Service, there is a long line of hardware which the Pentagon, especially Navy, has put into place for the next 4 years as part of this strategy. And I'm quoting here this flaming liberal known as John McCain, there is something called the military-industrial congressional complex, and it does see a certain, you find a certain support for ordering a large amount of expensive hardware. So you can see the forces which combine to turn this way beyond a concept to something which has, first of all, budgetary implication, and second, implications for the kind of armament we buy, rather than, let's say, things to counter terrorists. And finally, it has an effect on the service structure. Now, that's a very complicated subject. It would take us too long, and I'm certainly not an expert at it. The Army obviously was increased because of Afghanistan and Iraq, and as we cut back there, there's room to cut the Army. The sequester effects, all this. It's a very complicated subject. But in the end of the day, there is a sense that it's now, for 10 years, the Army got first bids, and it's now the Air Force and the Navy's turn. And again, I'm not sure there should be turns in this business, but it's one more thing which feeds into this direction. And finally, as a sociologist, I must admit there is a natural tendency in societies, in all societies, to look for an enemy. There's something, there's a phrase which, to turn to my discipline just for a second, it's called secondary gains. Secondary gains is something which, when you have something bad, but you get something good on the side. So if you're sick, for instance, you don't have to do the dishes, and you don't have to go to work, and you don't have to take the garbage out. You still don't want to have a flu, but you've got to have the flu to get something nice on the side. And so there is a similar situation here. Nobody really wants the enemy, certainly not to fight. But it has a unifying effect. It has an energizing effect. It helps community establish identity. And we just lost our enemy. I mean, we kind of, Al-Qaeda had been downgraded. And some in these dark sociological corners are kind of yearning to put in place another enemy. So all these forces combined very much need airing before we slide into a major recommitment to what could end up as a war. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood to suggest that there's anything wrong with what the Pentagon does. I think there is the job of the Pentagon to keep its eyes out for potential new enemies on the horizon. There is no question that China developed area denial, access denial weapons. There's no question that they're modernizing the military. How fast and how much and from what base and what their nebbish new aircraft carrier is going to do, we can talk about that. But nevertheless, it's a legitimate, completely legitimate issue. And it's legitimate for the Pentagon to prepare for that new rising danger. The question we ask in our paper, was this threat assessment properly reviewed by the next level of our government? Because the way it's supposed to work, at least the way I understand it, the Pentagon goes to the White House and Congress and says, we identified a new threat, here what we think we need to do about that, and then the White House and Congress goes to other parts of our government, to the State Department, and says, what say you? Do you have the same assessment? Do you think the same response? You go to the intelligence community, which is not part of the Pentagon, to the CIA, and ask them. And then it takes all this input, and you have a discussion with the President and the Security Council, with the appropriate committees in Congress, and they say yes or no. This did not happen. If you look at 4 different reports on the last 4 years at the White House, including by Jeff Bader, who was in charge of China policy in the National Security Council, you see that ASB is not mentioned once. Not mentioned once. There has been discussion of China policy around the pivot, by the way, a very short one. And some people have some reason to believe that the pivot, the sudden announcement that we're rebalancing now toward China, was more kind of a one-day wonder and part of the election campaign. But even if you take the pivot as a completely serious move, its main element never was military. I mean, sending 250 Marines to Australia, 2,600 miles from China, to an area which already has something like 300,000 American troops, is not a military buildup. And rebirthing 4 ships in Singapore is not a military buildup. I mean, these were symbolic moves. That's a long way from engaging in a major force restructure and in major budgetary allocation, which the ASB entails. So what we think is most necessary is that the high civilian authorities and the public will enjoy that discussion. Where we go with China, and what is the role of military in that? And just one comment on that, and then I'm very much looking forward to listen to my colleagues who really know China. I know 1 or 2 things about the United States, very little about China. When we go back to the question, what ought to be our policy toward China? And where does the military fit into that? Some people use the word containment, but that is considered the most kind of pushback policy as compared to cooperation, G2, or competition, or mix of cooperation competition. Containment is like going back to the Cold War. But if you think about it carefully, you see that ASB is much more aggressive than containment, because the essence of containment was that we drew a line between the Soviet bloc and the free world, and we said, we're not going to go on the other side of that line, and we will not let you come to our side of the line. So when we had the uprising in Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia those days, and in Hungary, the freedom fighters thought we would come to the help, but we didn't, because they were on the other side of the containment line. And when we thought that the communists were closing to our side of the line, or when the border wasn't clear in Afghanistan and in Vietnam, we got into local fights. But it was never our strategy to build up a military force and to go and attack the Soviet mainland in order to break them. The ASB does not draw a line and say, China, you can go up to this line, but if you go beyond that line, we will have to fight. It starts with, quote, a blinding attack on China's mainland. So it surely is a subject which deserves our attention, our discussion. Thank you.
With your permission, I'm going to speak sitting down, because I think you're arranged in such a way that at least the top of my head is visible to most of you. We're meeting at a time of the year when my mind tends to turn to air-sea beaches rather than air-sea battle. But I think the concept of air-sea battle is really worth devoting intellectual attention to, because it focuses the mind on some of the key strategic issues in trying to maintain peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region. And I'm going to touch on some of these questions. I should begin by emphasizing that I'm not an expert on air-sea battle in terms of the technical components and having looked at all of the military permutations that could flow from it. I have spent more of my time on dealing with China and particularly on the policy aspects of U.S.-China relations. But clearly this concept of air-sea battle is highly relevant to managing our relationship with China, which is the rapidly rising great power, which I'll touch on in a moment. We need a framework to order our thinking in looking at the concept of air-sea battle. Let me touch on some of the relevant considerations for the United States. The United States has enjoyed overwhelming superiority in naval and air power in the Western Pacific since the Battle of Midway during the middle parts of World War II. In Northeast Asia, a region where the vital interests of China, Russia, Japan, and the United States all intersect, the United States has critically important defense alliances with Japan and with the Republic of Korea. In addition, under the Taiwan Relations Act, the United States is required by law to consider any effort to determine the future of Taiwan by other than peaceful means a threat to the peace and security of the Western Pacific area and of grave concern to the United States. It is a fundamental national interest of the United States to preserve the credibility of its alliances. China's military modernization program has the potential to erode U.S. naval and air superiority and therefore to raise questions about the reliability of the United States as an alliance partner. The air-sea battle, the military modernization program in China is contributing to a competition of military capabilities between China and the United States of potentially unlimited scope and with significant budgetary implications for the future. I'm just outlining some of the considerations that we have to keep in our minds and thinking it from the standpoint of the United States. Let's look at some of the relevant considerations for China. For much of the last 170 years, China has been militarily so weak that it has been unable to defend its own territory. China's wars during this period, this 170-year period, have been fought either inside China or on its borders. In the course of these wars, China was forced to lose control of or to cede significant portions of its territory. Its opponents included the United States, Japan, the Soviet Union, India, Vietnam, and South Korea. During the 20th century, China suffered invasion and occupation of broad swaths of its territory by hostile forces for over a decade. The success of China's reform and openness policies since 1979 has radically altered this situation, so that China now has the second largest GDP in the world. Much of China's new wealth is concentrated in its coastal provinces. China has a fundamental national interest in being able to defend its wealth and its territory. China's military modernization program is designed to provide China with the capability to defend its own territory against hostile threats. Even if China's rate of economic growth slows considerably, many experts believe that the size of China's economy may surpass that of the United States within the next 10 years. So we're talking about a potential reversal of the Reagan years' advantage we had over the Soviet Union, which is that essentially in an arms race with the Soviet Union, our larger economy gave us the ability to sustain that arms race longer than the Soviets could manage. That could be reversed. Now, those are just some of the considerations. But my point is that the United States and China each have fundamental interests in the Western Pacific, and the real question is there middle ground between those fundamental interests, or are they inevitably incompatible with each other? In any event, this competition of military capabilities, I would argue, is the core factor that has been increasing the strategic rivalry between China and the United States, which is sometimes put in terms of the classic problem of a rising state and an established state ending up in conflict situations because of this type of growing strategic rivalry between them. Top leaders in both China and the United States have become concerned about this growing strategic rivalry between the two countries. They are conscious of the historical examples where the clash of interests, one scholar has claimed that in 15 cases since 1500, in 11 cases, conflict was the result when rising power ended up in a competition situation with an established power. To play with the math for a bit, that means in over 2/3 of the cases of rising states, you end up in conflict. So normal behavior between China and the United States as an established power and as a rising power is going to lead us into a potential conflict situation. So this is, shall we say, the historical problem we're facing, what some people have called the Thucydides trap. How do we avoid letting natural behavior, given the circumstances between our two countries, producing an unacceptable outcome in terms of national interest? This is no longer a historical problem. This is a real current problem of American foreign policy. And it's not accidental that top leaders of both countries, China and the United States, have endorsed the concept of trying to create a new type of great power relationship between China and the United States that can prevent history from repeating itself by limiting further growth in strategic rivalry and by striking a stable and mutually acceptable balance between competition and cooperation in the U.S.-China bilateral relationship. Now, we don't know whether this will be possible, but this has been set at the highest level by both countries as the strategic goal of our policies. This poses the question of how do we bring the military activities of each side into conformity with the strategic goal of limiting further growth in strategic rivalry between the two countries. Now, you see, this is the core problem. Does it make sense to have a presidentially set strategic goal of limiting strategic rivalry, but to have the militaries of each country, for valid reasons looked at in a narrow military context, engaging in activities and programs which are contributing to increased strategic rivalry? If you don't try to resolve that contradiction, then you have an incoherent policy, and that can produce unintended consequences, as we know from too many examples to be worth citing under these circumstances. What are some of the other considerations? The one I've just mentioned is what I would call the core strategic problem of the United States in the Asia-Pacific region: establishing coherence to our policy objectives. Both of our countries at the highest level believe that conflict between China and the United States is not in our interest, but then we are behaving in ways that make the likelihood of conflict greater. So there's the problem. Air-sea battle helps us to focus our minds on this problem. One of the issues touched on by Professor Etzioni: how do you limit escalation? Air-sea battle is a response to China's growing counter-intervention capabilities, which are raising questions about the survivability of our aircraft carriers and our fleets in the Pacific Ocean if China were to be able to develop targetable ballistic missiles against which we had inadequately secure defenses. So air-sea battle essentially is a way of neutralizing the hostile forces that could damage our capabilities in the Pacific Ocean. So what if the worst case scenario happens? Let's say a Chinese ballistic missile takes out a U.S. aircraft carrier. Well, on the U.S. side, the question is, if we see that China has that capability, and if the circumstances suggest a possibility that an aircraft carrier could be taken out, then the sensible thing to do would be to take out that capability. But the capability rests on the Chinese mainland. And if you attack the Chinese mainland, you have an escalation control problem. Now, if we look at the historical examples, we recognize that there were strong military reasons for attacking bases in Manchuria that were supporting the war effort against us in Korea. But General MacArthur could never get permission from Washington to engage in such activities because they were concerned about the possible of retaliation in the European theater or of expanding the geographical scope of the war. The same problem occurred in the Vietnam War, where China was actively supporting our enemies in the Vietnam War, and yet we never undertook strikes against the China mainland because of the risk of geographic expansion of the scope of the war. So air-sea battle proposes strikes on the Chinese mainland. Now, in this case, China would presumably be the enemy. But the question still is, how do you manage escalation under these questions? I'm not saying that that's a reason for saying that air-sea battle is not a valid response to China's growing counter-intervention capabilities. Incidentally, that's the Chinese term for what we're referring to as anti-access area denial capabilities. From China's standpoint, it's to keep the enemy from being able to penetrate into China's territory. The other question, or one of the other questions we have to think about, is what are the threats that could actually justify dangerous warfighting scenarios between China and the United States? One doesn't trivially get oneself involved in a situation where escalation is difficult to control and where the risks are of immense proportion. For example, it is simply not credible under any conceivable circumstance to assume that the United States would take high-risk actions with the potential to escalate to unacceptable levels over unoccupied bits of rock in the East China Sea. Just stop and think about it. I mean, that's an inconceivable scenario. There are dangers, obviously, associated with the Diaoyu-Senkaku dispute, But the idea that you could somehow use that as a way to suck you into an escalatory picture where literally millions of American lives would be at risk, all over unoccupied rocks, suggests that there is a disconnect between possible capabilities and the value factors that could justify assuming those types of risks. In the case of Taiwan, which is occupied and is a very important piece of rock in the East China Sea, while the issue is acutely sensitive for Beijing, we have a stable basis for managing the issue because Chinese leaders have defined as the only warfighting issue the separation of Taiwan formally from the mainland, and U.S. policy doesn't support that option. We have a one China policy. And so therefore, Taiwan would require fundamental changes in policy in Beijing and in Washington in order for it to become a warfighting case between the United States and China. And so therefore, how much money should be spent on developing capabilities for war scenarios relating to Taiwan when the ability of diplomacy to stabilize the situation has been demonstrated over the last 30 years sufficiently well to establish credibility that that can be managed successfully through that method. There's an additional problem in looking at escalation scenarios. The Korean War started because the Soviet Union, North Korea, and China miscalculated the U.S. bottom line. The Chinese entered the war because the United States miscalculated the Chinese bottom line when we authorized the UN forces to cross the 38th parallel. In other words, our record in being able to calculate the bottom lines of the others in critical situations is poor. And if we can't calculate the bottom lines of the other side, we can't control escalation with any degree of confidence. Now, to me, this is not a basis for discrediting air-sea battle, because the United States cannot sit idly by if the Chinese create capabilities that erode the credibility of our alliances because of the belief the United States cannot operate in areas where we need to operate to ensure the security of our allies. But this has to be related to the policy problem of how do we stabilize the strategic rivalry between China and the United States. And that depends on an answer to the question of, if it's a fundamental interest of the United States to maintain the credibility of our alliances with Japan and South Korea, and if it's a fundamental interest of China to be able to defend its territory and the new wealth that is created over the last 30-plus years, is there middle ground so that China can have sufficient defense capabilities to have reasonable confidence that it can deter attacks on its territory and its wealth, and the United States maintains sufficient credibility so that we are seen as a reliable ally in the region. This is the area we haven't explored, in part because United States and Chinese military forces, until recently, have simply not been in sufficient contact with each other to have a sensible dialogue on such matters. Now, the encouraging aspect is that we now are beginning, belatedly, to develop the military-to-military exchanges that we should, frankly, have been continuing on an uninterrupted basis for the last 30-plus years and have not done so. And we now are going to take time to begin to explore these types of issues. If we don't begin to explore them, then the idea of trying to create a new type of great power relationship that can limit strategic rivalry between China and the United States is a lot of hot air and has nothing to do with the actual policies that each side is pursuing. So this is the big issue that air-sea battle poses. And arguing that it's a good or a bad concept strikes me as missing the main point. The main point is there is that strategic rivalry. China's defense programs have good, valid reasons for them, but they are creating problems for us in terms of eroding, potentially, our military capabilities in the region. And how do we stabilize that situation? This is where we need to devote our attention, and I think air-sea battle is a very good way of trying to get our mind to focus on those questions. Thank you.
Okay, first off, I have to give a disclaimer. What I say does not represent the views of the U.S. government or National Defense University. I think that'll become obvious fairly quickly, but I have to tell you that. The ambassador hit the key point. We need a national strategy for the relationship we want to have with China. We need to encourage her economic growth for the very real reason that we need the economic growth, and at the same time, make sure she understands that missteps can lead to conflict. Now, this may surprise you, but sometimes the U.S. government doesn't function particularly well. And we've been struggling with this whole idea of a strategy for China for several years now, but we haven't quite pushed it through the bureaucracy. What ASB is part of the Pentagon's job. The problem presented to the Navy and Air Force primarily is anti-access aerial denial will keep you from closing to the shoreline to project American power if that's what the National Command Authority tells you to do. So the Pentagon has to plan and figure out how to do that. Now, the Pentagon exists to plan. You may not know it, but in 1939, all our war plans were colored series plans. We had a plan to fight Great Britain in 1939, the red plan. The more embarrassing plan, as far as the Canadians were concerned, was the plan to fight Canada was called the pink plan. But we actually had a plan to fight Canada in 1939. So as the professor said in his paper, the role of the Pentagon is to plan, but the role that should be both of the government and of the American public as a whole is discuss that planning. Does it make sense? Now, air-sea battle jumped to the front because there's a vacuum out there. Everybody knows China's growing. There's some conflict potentially here. Nobody was saying anything. So the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment put forward this as an operational concept and then said this would be a proposed strategy and how you would execute it. Because there was nothing else out there, that immediately became the strategy that everybody took it. The Chief of Naval Operations and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force both walked that back. And now what it really is an office with 11 officers and 5 contractors. And the function is to do the Title X train, man, and equip functions of the armed forces, of the services, to coordinate the use of systems. Because this may also surprise you, but it's not unusual for the Air Force to buy an airplane that can't talk to the Navy, and vice versa. And that's part of what this office is supposed to do. Stop doing stupid stuff. But Dr. Etzioni made an extensive argument that is absolutely accurate, that it's ASB is, nobody knows what it means. The Chinese don't know what it means. They see it as a threat. Our allies don't know what it means. We desperately need to have a review of a strategy for China, both a potential political strategy, and then if worse comes to worse, what's your military strategy? So that's what I did. About 18 months ago, the strategy department in the Pentagon called me in and asked, look, we got this air-sea battle thing out there and it's causing a lot of kerfuffle. A, and B, we can't afford it. If we have to fight China, is there a proposed strategy that would allow you to do this in a way we can afford that is less aggressive? And so that was the tasker I got. So I came up with what I called offshore controlled to differentiate it from the concept of air-sea battle was going onshore. The problem is this scared our allies too, because they saw offshore control and thought offshore balancing, which is code word for withdrawing to the United States. So what I should have called it is offshore control, defense of the first island chain. And it is defense of the first island chain that's the focus. It's a highly unlikely conflict. I do not think conflict with China is likely. But then in early 1913, 1912, there were lots of books that explained how a war between France and Germany was impossible because of the economic connections. The response to that is never underestimate the human capacity for stupidity when operating in groups. And that's what we've got to be concerned about. So what we need a strategy for is three functions: assure the allies, deter China, and guide our spending and budgeting so we're not wasting money that frankly we don't have. And we must deal with the reality of a much, much lower defensive budget. So I didn't have enough copies, but I passed out some maps. And what that shows, we have a tremendous strategic advantage over China because of the geographic position. That is one thing they can't change. The first island chain, which is the chain of islands that goes from Japan down through the southwest islands of Japan, across Taiwan, picking up the Philippines in an arc around the Philippines to Indonesia, and then an arc up to Singapore. That essentially is a barrier that limits China's access to the sea. That's the first island chain. If the first island chain is penetrated, there is the second island chain, Japan, down through Guam, down through a little farther south in the Philippines, across through Indonesia, or even Australia. And so that gives us a tremendous operational advantage. The strategic advantage comes from, even if you get through the first and second island chain, you still can't trade with the world without the permission of the United States, because you have the passes through Indonesia and Malacca Straits, Lombok, and Sunda. You have a couple places north and south of Australia. And if you try to come from the east, you can go around the southern end of South America, very difficult. You can come through the canal, or if you're really a global warming enthusiast and think there's room for shipping in the north, unfortunately we're finding it's too shallow for serious shipping. But that, again, the U.S. can control those. So the concept uses our superior geographic position to present a problem China can't solve, but to do so in a non-threatening manner. We won't do this. We can't do this unless China attacks first. Because if China doesn't attack first, the allies aren't on side. They won't help us with this. So it's an offer to China that says, look, we need you to continue to grow. That's central to our strategy, under the global strategy. But you can't be aggressive. You can't abuse other nations. Because if you do, that will trigger this response. So what's the strategy? Well, strategy has, I use Elliott Cohen's strategy, assumptions. And assumptions are those things that you can't know, but you have to assume because you have to plan. For instance, we couldn't know if the government of Iraq would stay in place after we invaded. We had to make an assumption. If you assume they will stay, you only need about 150,000 troops because they'll handle policing. If you assume they'll leave, you need 450,000 troops, which highlights a second point about assumptions. If you get them wrong, there's a heavy penalty. So you better have a plan for if your assumptions are wrong. The second thing is ends, ways, means. This is the classic expression of military strategy. Your ends are your goals, your ways are how you're going to do them, and the means are what are you going to use them. But it's not independent. It's ends, ways, and means all run together. Because you can have the best goals in the world. I can really want the new Mercedes-Benz 500. But if I look at the furlough, I think I better watch my money a little more. So again, that's not a strategy. That's a goal. Then you have to have priorities because you'll never have enough stuff to do everything at once. From your priorities, you'll sequence. And finally, you have to have a theory of victory. How do you make this thing win? What do you do when you caught the bus? We caught the bus in Iraq and had no idea what we were going to do with it. So you better have a plan for that. So what are my assumptions? One is China starts it for two reasons. The first reason is that puts you on your back foot. It's more difficult if China starts first because the offense gets an advantage. The second reason is it's hard to believe the United States is going to somehow think, well, here's a great idea, let's have a war with China. We could elect a Texan again, but I don't think so. The second assumption is it's a long war. There was the idea that we could have a short war with China. That's just not true. Wars between continental-sized powers last years, so assume that. There will be massive damage to the global economy on day one. The last time we had a war in a totally integrated global economy was, of course, World War I, and it caused massive damage immediately. And it took years to recover from. So that's going to happen. Space and cyber are offense dominated. That is, it is easier to destroy assets in space than defend them. It is easier to attack cyber systems than defend them. So first mover has an advantage in space and cyber, but therefore if your plan depends upon space and cyber, it's escalatory, because to defeat it, I got to go first. And last, we do not understand China's decision-making process for nuclear weapons. Over the years, we'd kind of worked out with the Soviet Union. We knew what steps, we knew what would indicate they were thinking about. We have no idea with China, frankly. So you got to be really careful there. So what are the ends, ways, and means? The ends I want, or the end goal, is not the total defeat of China. Nuclear weapons make the concept of a total World War II type victory a Pyrrhic event, because they may use their nukes, and then nobody wins. So you just want China to cease the aggression and preferably be in a position where it is difficult for them to resume the aggression. So that's a very modest end, but that's all you want. You don't want the Communist Party to go away, because then who's running China? And when China has civil wars, these are not minor events. They last a long time and kill tens of millions of people. So what are the means? Again, use existing means. We don't have to buy a lot of new carriers. We don't have to buy new long-range bombers. We don't need lots of new toys to make it work. So use existing means and the geographic advantage we have to present China with a problem it can't solve. And the way is by economic strangulation. And you do this by denying the use of the South China Sea, East China Sea. China is a trading nation, export-driven. I don't think that cutting off the fuel will bring China to its knees, because they can adjust for that. What they can adjust for is the collapse of the economy with exports. About 28% of China's economy, according to The Economist World Factbook, is based on exports. So you deny them the use of the first island chain, not immediately, but over a period of time. You adjust this thing slowly. You defend the first island chain, combined and joint with those allies who wish to join in. You ask for no permission to run any offensive strikes against China out of allied territory, because not many allies are really thinking it's a good idea to strike China. You don't ask them to. You dominate outside the first island chain, because once we move outside, our Navy is truly a global Navy. The Chinese Navy is not. Even if it is, it has to fight its way through that first island chain, and it really doesn't have that capability yet. And so you blockade and the key shipping and keep China out. And we can have a discussion about blockade after. Some people will say you can't do it. I've now seen about a half a dozen studies that say you can and describe in pretty good detail how you can. So the bottom line is we deter China. Now, one of the things we want to, the professor made a good point. Make sure planning for war doesn't drive you to war. Well, if you're buying all kinds of weapons that can penetrate into China, if I'm a Chinese strategist, that makes me a little nervous. But if you're buying weapon systems that blockade, which is a strategic offensive, obviously, it's destroying your economy, but only can be used if China attacks, then I'm not as worried about it. You assure allies. Essentially, you're drawing the line you suggested. You cross this line, these things will happen. You don't cross the line, we're okay. Let's keep trading. And when I emphasize the keep trading, this is not just because it's a great deal for the world getting richer, but it's also because it makes China more vulnerable to the strategy. So if they do what they have to do economically, they become more vulnerable to us militarily. We got to assure our allies, friends, and neutrals. Frankly, I've now talked to senior Japanese and Korean officials at the ministry and all the way up through what their equivalent of NSCs are. They have no idea what the U.S. strategy is because we haven't expressed it. They've seen air-sea battle, and they're pretty sure it's air-sea battle. The other problem is air-sea battle's mostly secret stuff. We got these cool toys that are going to win. It's not just top secret, it's actually specially compartmented. So most Americans, so like say I'm a 4-star admiral in the Navy, and the Japanese admiral says, how are you going to do this? I say, well, don't worry, we got a secret program. Well, you're my friend, tell me. I don't know, they won't tell me. Literally, most of these programs, our operators are not allowed to know what they are. Trust me. So that's the basis of a strategy based on penetration. A strategy based on offshore control is a little different. I'm going to practice this all openly. You're going to watch me practice blockade. I'm going to prove to you I don't need either space or cyber to do this because I can do this with surface search radar and HF radio. So, yep, you can go first and take down my cyber and my space, and that's okay. I still got this. So there's no benefit to going first, and that's one of the messages we have to get across. And then by this, we also assure our allies, because they practice with us. It's easier for an allied nation to to have an exercise with America if the only thing we're asking is to defend your homeland. That's all we'll practice, defending your homeland, with your forces and our forces working together. And then finally, guide U.S. defense investment. We are about to spend a lot of money on what is a still unproven airplane for questionable reasons. We're about to spend $20 billion on carriers that are vulnerable. It's a technology that is now, the first of the really big deck, angled deck carriers came out about 1950, so 60 years old. According to the plan, the Ford class carrier will steam, the class will steam till 2100. That's about 150 years. That's like Lord Nelson's battleship, the HMS Victory, which was built in 1765 and was critical in the fight in 1805, would not have been so good 150 years later at the Battle of Jutland. I would not want to be one of the sailors in it. I don't want to be a sailor on a U.S. carrier. And then you have to have assurance it's win, because there is no deterrence in a strategy that people can't figure out can win. So you want to play your war games and assure yourself it can win. You want to have the most devious people you can playing the Chinese to see if they can beat it. And we've gone through a number of these cycles now and are starting to learn that. So what is beginning to happen is this conversation is taking place. Unfortunately, it's taking place in secret for the most part, behind closed doors. There's not a lot of attention in the White House because the White House doesn't see the issue. And the Pentagon's off doing its thing. And of course, defense industry is pretty worried. There's some big cuts coming. If you want to protect your toy, you got to have a way to do it. After the first Gulf War, when we started the big cuts, everybody wanted to be part of network-centric warfare. It was the buzzword. No matter what you were making, if it was meals ready to eat, it was critical for network-centric warfare because that's what the Pentagon was buying. So now that's the ASB role. We've got to stop that. We've got to have this conversation. I think this is a good place to start. Thank you.
I think it was a very illuminating beginning of a discussion today. I want to take the opportunity of having the podium to ask the first question. Now turn over to the rest of you. One of the points you make in your article, Professor Etzioni, is the worry really that preparations for war actually may be a kind of slide into war. And I think some of the things you've just told us about ways to plan this that don't necessarily lead that direction are very helpful. One of your responses is that we need to have the civilian leadership more engaged in discussing these issues. So I think you come to this a little bit at the end of your article, but one of my concerns as a historian is that we often find that civilians are more confident of military ability to get things done than the military is. And so sometimes, a discussion in the civilian leadership doesn't necessarily lead to a solution. So I just want to know how you might respond to that.
Well, it's a very fair questions. And as we heard now from my colleagues, there are really very severe structural flaws in the way we deal with these issues. And to be honest with you, I don't know how to overcome them. I spent 1 year in the White House. And what you learn is it's extremely understaffed. There are very few people in that building, including the building next door. And the average staffer I knew had to deal with 4 agencies, aside from going to all kind of meetings. So it basically an eighth of a person overlooks interior, an eighth of a person look over agriculture, and another eighth. When you come then to the Pentagon, when we challenged the Pentagon, they brought a truck full of documents and said, the answer is right here, why don't you read it? And you see how strong our case is. How dare you dare talk back to us when you haven't answered this truck full of documents? For them to put 200 people on spelling out a document is child's play. Now, I'm saying it in a slightly amusing way, but it's not amusing because the mismatch between our civilian head and is really very considerable. And so I don't know how to solve that problem other than I think that's where think tanks and those of us who are privileged to be in academics or public intellectuals have to fill the gap, which is left out there. But I think both Ambassador Oy and T.X. Hermes have valid answers. One is this mutual assured limitations on forces. Then we create a new term. Instead of assured mutual destruction, assured mutual limitations on forces. And the second is that the much less belligerent way of think about it. I think a subject which, again, you could very easily join, so maybe we need another meeting. When we talk about Chinese military buildup, I think we should not leave that standing as if it reached the level of a serious threat. I'm certainly not an expert on every missile and such, but China's domestic challenges, in my judgment, are so severe that I don't see, between the aging and the environmental issues and the running out of water and corruption and all that, and the rapidly declining growth. Frankly, it's really not kosher to quote yourself, but I can't resist. So I think my best article is the end of the Chinese century happened before it started. So I don't see this significant military build-up. They start from such a low level that I think we can get much easier to the point that the ambassador implied, that if they would be really taking off in a big way, but that deserves a whole other conversation.
I'd like to address the confidence piece here. I think it's very important that military officers are honest and say that these are going to be long wars. There's no such thing as a short war. If you look at World War I, one of the problems is the Germans faced a strategic problem which they thought was getting worse. And the military said, yeah, we can clean this up, give us a couple months, we'll get there, bam. If they come in and said, yeah, 4 years, 1 million dead, shatter your economy, we'll be there. Probably the leadership might, well, it was Kaiser, so maybe not, but the leadership should have said, no thanks. That's the danger with the Chinese leadership, is they may be convinced that they can get a quick win. And that's why, by going with a strategy like air-sea battle that involves cyber and space, if I can defeat your cyber and space, I can get a quick win. If you demonstrate a strategy that is a long, slow war, I think it's really a deterrent. As far as the ability of the U.S. government to function, remember, we have a government designed by geniuses specifically not to work.
Yeah, you're doing very well.
Okay, I'm going to open the floor to questions. So we have a microphone, so I'll go back and forth. Please identify yourself, and then if you have a question to a specific person, refer to who that is, and try to keep it short because we have a lot of questions. I'll start here in the front, and then I'll bounce back and forth.
Thank you. My name is Arnold Zeitlin, and I teach in China. And I've just come from the Heritage Foundation, where I attended the launching of a book called The Dragon Extends Its Reach by a man named Larry Wurtzel, who I'm sure you know. And Mr. Wurtzel said at one point during the discussion that perhaps 5 or 10 years ago you could say the PLA was designed to defend wealth and the borders of China. But now it's a very different PLA. And I'm wondering if I could get some comment from you on what the role of the PLA is now, especially as China shows a certain amount of assertiveness in the South China Sea.
I'm not going to speak about their role because I'm not an expert on China. I can speak more about their capabilities. They clearly have massively better capabilities than they did 10 years ago. And if they continue the building program they've got, that will continue to increase. But what I find interesting is that we point to their A2AD and say, my God, this is a massive problem. It'll cost us a huge amount of money and time to overcome. But then if you say, well, why don't we just use A2AD? Why don't we get with Japan and the Philippines and Indonesia and reverse that and make them spend all the money? That seems to work to me. So while they have the capability, they don't have the capability to defeat an A2AD system. And China is vulnerable. Remember, they have to trade globally. The only way you can trade globally is if you have a global sea control navy. And you can do that. And China could do that if they were willing to invest about 3 decades and somewhere from $3 to $5 trillion then in 3 decades they might have a sea-controlled Navy if they can solve the underwater problem, the submarine problem. So I don't see them as a great global threat. They can certainly threaten China or Japan with medium-range ballistic missiles. Taiwan will be absolutely saturated with short-range ballistic missiles. The longer-range ballistic missiles are beginning to range Guam, the Philippines, places like that. So it is a very different PLA than it was 10 years ago. Whether it's going to be used offensively is a question for people who study the Politburo.
I don't think the Chinese military believes that it is a global force. And I don't think that they believe that they have achieved the ability to defend Chinese territory and wealth against in a full war situation. So the real issue is the classic defense dilemma, which is how much is enough? Because I would argue that under foreseeable circumstances, there is no way for China to get total assurance that it can defend itself against all threats. And I don't think the United States can either. We cannot have 100% confidence, for example, that we can defend ourselves against the ballistic missile strikes from China in a missile exchange. So there are limits on both sides. China faces a problem which in some ways is unique. It's much stronger than it was before, but when it tries to use its increased strength to muscle its neighbors on sovereignty issues, it drives them into the arms of the United States, which is not China's purpose. So the dynamic is one that encourages responsible Chinese behavior. Because if in the eyes, not of China, but of its neighbors and the United States, China is behaving irresponsibly, then the countries around China show solidarity in opposing China. But if China behaves responsibly, there is no support for a containment strategy, and there's no support for policies that might result in situations where countries had to choose between China and the United States. None of the countries of East Asia wants to be forced to choose between China and the United States, because unlike the Soviet Union, China's rise has been beneficial to its neighbors, not detrimental to them. But they do want the United States to remain reliably engaged in East Asia, so that China can continue to rise without creating an environment in which they will feel that they are potentially threatened. This is a dynamic which is made to order for skillful diplomacy. The question is how to integrate the military factors into an environment where diplomacy can bear the principal burden, but you have the assurance of sufficient military capabilities on both sides so you don't feel you can be coerced into undesirable outcomes.
I just want to add something very briefly about our allies and Chinese neighbors. There is a lot of merit in what's called burden sharing, where some of these countries picking up some of the costs and participating in the defensive buildup. But Japan is different, and I think I don't find sufficient awareness of this issue. And because you live in China, you may correct me or support me. I don't know a much better way of pushing China's hot buttons than encourage the rise of Japanese militarism, which is rising on its own because of the historical history. It's really very similar to the Holocaust for the Jewish and for Israel. They have a very deep in their Chinese psychic this humiliation, suffering, which Japan inflicted on them. Unlike Germany, Japan never acknowledged really what it did or apologized for it. And now they have this history revision where they're going back to blaming China for the comfort women and all the other things. And they have their own reason to go militaristic. So for us, in any way to encourage it, I think we may gain a few dollars, but this would be a penny wise and pound foolish.
Okay, somewhere over here in the front there.
Thank you. My name is Matthew Robertson. I write for the Epic Times. It was wonderful speeches. I was really struck by the reference Mr. Hams made to we don't want the CCP to collapse, the Chinese Communist Party, and I was curious about that, about why that is exactly, and with say the slowing growth now and many social issues that we're aware of. Is it not a thing to consider, a possibility that may be in the future? And in all the contingencies that are being planned, would it not be, or should it not be, one of the contingencies that the U.S. needs to plan for, or even fortify Chinese civil society, or somehow plan for other Chinese futures? So kind of why isn't part of the discussion now, do you think? And then also, sort of, if it's not an a priori position, what would the circumstances be inside China that would make it a possibility for that to be part of the discussion in the United States?
We definitely don't want to collapse the CCP. If there can be some kind of managed transition from an authoritarian to a democratic, like we saw in Taiwan, that is manageable. A collapse of the CCP is likely to lead to civil war. At least that's certainly been the pattern for the last 1,000 years or so in China. When they lose the mandate of heaven and it goes to hell, it really goes to hell. Except this time they've got nuclear weapons, so this could be a whole different level of civil war. I think it's arrogant to think we can manage that, or to think we can prepare Chinese civil society, etc. I think we would avoid trying to encourage that. We want to encourage trade. We want to encourage economic growth, with the hope that at some point that leads to this transition as it did in other authoritarian states. There's no guarantee, but it seems to be the best bet we've got. As far as what we can do to prepare for it, that's going to be a wild ride when it happens.
Hi, thanks. I'm Mike Billington. I work with Lyndon LaRouche in the Executive Intelligence Review. Let me mention first that I don't think we should assume, as I think the panel has, that Obama and his controllers, at least, or his backers, are so unaware of all of this air-sea battle policy and what the threat is, which I think you've laid out very clearly. And I want to ask the panel to address this in the context of the parallel situation with Russia. And I know that's not the subject here, but I think we have to see this as combined. You know that the Russian leadership has been even more vocal than China, that the ABM systems being set up on its border are a threat to their system, a threat of a counterforce, that they are not willing to allow or to be fooled again in Syria the way they were in Libya. That this is protecting civilians when in fact it's a regime change and overthrow. And even Medvedev has said, saying, I don't want to scare you, but nonetheless said, we're heading for a nuclear war. It's a very real possibility. So I think we have to see what's happening in the conflict with China and Russia working more and more closely together as a very serious global threat of war. So I'd like you to address that relationship and how you see the impact of this on the Pacific issue.
I'm not sure I 100% understand your question, but let me try to answer it. Clearly, there are strategic issues involved in how one deals with Russia. Russia is still the #2 nuclear power in the world. And one of the problems with Russia is its conventional forces are weak enough so that it seems to believe that it has to rely on its nuclear forces for its security, which raises questions about how far it can go in terms of arms limitations, which the United States is prepared to to do. There is, you're right that the Russians do believe that the actions that we have justified in terms of an Iranian threat, in fact, are either intended to or simply have the collateral consequence of damaging Russia's nuclear deterrent, which is why they have reacted so strongly to the proposals to place the ABM systems in Europe. The cooperation between China and Russia is significant and important, and is rooted in the fact that neither country wishes to see a world dominated by a sole superpower. It is not rooted in high levels of mutual confidence in the strategic objectives of each other. I would say that it is a very unequal type of relationship. The Russians are concerned about their strategic future because of China's rise. China is remarkably unconcerned about Russia as a potential threat. In decades of sitting in high-level meetings with China's leaders, I have never heard them refer to the potential for the Russian threat since the end of the period of their hostility. In meetings with Russian leaders, I have heard that issue of a potential China threat raised on a variety of occasions. So the underlying psychological factors between the two countries are different, but they have a common interest in having a multipolar world. And in fact, I think that we have a multipolar world. So I think that, in a sense, the strength of the glue for a bilateral relationship between the two countries is not that strong. But I do think that they have the best bilateral relations in recent history, and that's likely to continue because of sufficient overlap of common interests in a variety of areas, including in the Middle East, where both of them do not wish to see the Libya example of outside intervention repeated in the case of Syria, even though they may have somewhat different attitudes, where Syria has been a historic client state of Russia, not of China. And so there are different, there's a bit of a trade-off there, where the Russians defer to the Chinese on North Korean issues, and the Chinese defer to Russia on Syrian issues, if you will. And so they try to maintain respect for each other's interests in that fashion. I wouldn't overstress that dynamic, but one sees elements of it, and I've heard statements by Russians and by Chinese which are consistent with the picture I've just laid out. I think the strategic issues between the United States and China are of a much greater order of magnitude than the strategic issues with Russia. Russia is a diminished country. It does not pose the type of strategic rivalry issues that are at the heart of the difficulty of managing the U.S.-China relationship. But I think that Russia is very important because of its potential impact on Europe, which is an area where the United States has very important interests, and therefore we cannot afford to neglect Russia. The only additional thing I would add is that I am not impressed with the wisdom of our policy toward Russia.
Okay, back to this side. Yeah. 1, 2, 1.
Jeff Dyer from the Financial Times. I actually wanted to ask a question related to Russia, but from a slightly different angle, primarily for Professor Hammers. Firstly, at a practical level, is there not an obvious overland route to supply the Chinese economy that, while not keeping it completely flowing, would substantially undermine a blockade? And then at a geopolitical level, would the enunciation of a blockade strategy not inevitably push China much more closely towards Russia, even with all the caveats we've just heard about the inherent rivalry between the two countries?
The track across Russia is the dual-track Trans-Siberian Railroad. There's another track that leads out of northwest China and goes up through the stands with all of the superb maintenance that both the Russians and the Central Asians are known for. It is dual track. It can't even begin to handle the capacity of the ports. Remember, the strategy is not to keep China from importing. They will be able to import the food and fuel they need, because in a totalitarian state you can control that pretty well. It's to destroy the competitive of their business exporting. You cannot export enough through those routes. There simply isn't the capacity. One problem is, because China and Russia have never trusted each other, the rail gauges are different. And if it gets to Europe, you got to change the rail gauge again, because the Europeans never trust the Russians. So it's two transits, which is the most important or the most expensive piece in transit stuff. There simply is not the capacity to trade. Now, the other thing that makes the declared strategy of blockade, one of the advantages is it's slow. If we have a confrontation and you've got to advise the National Security Council and you're saying, look, our option's air-sea battle, how soon do we have to go? And the answer is about 5 seconds ago. Because if they take down our space and cyber, we have a problem. But if it's blockade, you go, well, you got time. I mean, even once we decide to do it, we probably won't put it in place for 20 or 30 days. Why do you want 20 or 30 days? There are very few examples of wars between nuclear powers. In fact, there are two. The Russian-Chinese River War and the Kargil conflict between India and Pakistan. In both cases, both sides were very, very careful not to escalate, although it got to be a pretty serious fight between the Russians and Chinese. Whereas the Pakistanis and Indians used to attack each other with army corps, the Pakistanis thought it was a great accomplishment to sneak about 1,000 guys 12 kilometers into India and hide on a mountaintop. Woohoo! The Indians responded not by massing corps on the Pakistani border, but by actually pulling those back and sending selected troops to the mountains and saying, this is what we're going to do, announcing it and shooting. The one big confrontation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union over Cuba was the same way. You'll notice we put the blockade, didn't call it a blockade because that's an act of war. We put the quarantine in place slowly. We gave our diplomats time to negotiate. They pulled the missiles out of Cuba. We didn't mention it, but we also pulled our missiles out of Turkey. So it was actually a deal made. That's what you want to do. When there's a confrontation between nuclear powers, slow everything down. Let the normal tendency for caution, which has been the pattern of the few examples we've got, take place. You do not want to accelerate this. It's just not a good idea. So I think that's the key. By stating it, putting it in place slowly, giving people time to react, go, oh, that was a mistake. That's not what we meant to do. Because remember, the Communist Chinese have fought 4 times since the Communists took over. And the pattern is, whether they win or lose, and they were winning against India in '62, they didn't do well against the UN in Korea. They didn't do well against the Russians, and they got their butts handed to them by the Vietnamese. But each case they said, we won. They declared victory and came home. I'm good with that. They can declare a victory and call it over, because they'll never get back the trust in trade. It'll take them 2 or 3 decades for their economy to recover from that mistake.
Ann Hoffman, private citizen and organizer. First, a just quick comment on who's more important to China, Russia, or us. 20 years ago, rising stars in China learned Russian. Today, nobody learns Russian anymore. They learn English. But I'm both terrified and gratified by reassured by today's program. I never heard of air-sea battle. It sounds like a loony idea. And I'm delighted that the 3 of you agree with that. How on earth do we get the American people to understand that there are people in the U.S. who are thinking about that and get them to stop it?
Okay, first off, air-sea battle is not a loony idea. It's an operational concept which is nested under the operational concept of joint operational access. If Iran closes the straits, we're going to want to be able to get in there and get oil flowing again, or the global economy really, really hurts. Well, Russia is willing to sell very sophisticated anti-access weapons to the Iranians. So we have to deal with that problem for Iran. We may have to deal with it with certain aspects. For instance, if the unthinkable happens and we're in conflict with China, we're going to need some aspects of air-sea battle to make sure we can get energy and food into Japan. We've got to feed the allies. So there are very good operational reasons for this. What we've blundered on is the strategic communication because it filled this absolute vacuum. And this may also surprise you, but sometimes the press gets excited about things. When there's nothing else to write about and there's no topic, or you got air-sea battle, this is a pretty good idea. That's their job. The administration missed the opportunity to say, well, wait a minute, we actually are thinking about a strategy that is not air-sea battle. They keep saying we're rolling it back, but as you keep telling me you're rolling it back, but you don't offer anything in its place, I just think you're lying to me. I know most Americans would not believe the government would lie to them, but so it's not a loony idea. It's a necessary idea. What was loony was letting it get out of control and be perceived as this.
My name is Carl Osgood. I also write for Executive Intelligence Review. I would like to ask the panel about the role of Andrew Marshall and the Office of Net Assessment in all of this. As you may know, Marshall has been obsessed with a war like China for more than 20 years, basically since the end of the Cold War. The CSBA report that you, Colonel Hammes, referred to was produced by, the authors were people who had served under Marshall there. So they are indoctrinated in his ideas, his way of thinking. And when I asked the Air-Sea Battle Office what was the role of the ONA in developing the concept, the air-sea battle concept, they said that ONA was not directly involved in developing the concept, but they do provide the data on the anti-access area denial threats. So I'd like to hear more insight from you on their role, and Marshall's role in particular.
Frankly, I don't know. I wasn't part of that discussion. I know that one of Andrew Marshall's office's jobs is to put out contracts to explore problems. Again, given how much money you're giving the Pentagon every year, I would want to be thinking about every potential problem, including possibly the Martians. Because, my God, what else are they doing with $500 billion a year? We should not ever be surprised. So you think, I want the Pentagon thinking about these questions. Then starting the debate and saying, okay, that's Mr. Marshall's office, if that in fact is true that he pushed it, but certainly CSBA did, and CNAS, another think tank, has a different approach. The Japanese are very, very interested in the offshore control approach. Their concept of dynamic defense, which the new government, they added an adjective, but I can't remember what it is, because you can't ever use the old government's name for something. But essentially it's a recognition that the threat to Japan has shifted from the north, where China against Russia, to the southwest against China. And so dynamic defense looks at using A2AD to defend Japanese islands, not to attack China, but only defend their own islands. And that's a valid concern for Japan and a valid use of that technology. And again, the A2AD things that we developed, letting aircraft talk to ships, ships talk to land batteries, etc., all improve defensive capabilities too, as well as offensive capabilities. It's a set of equipment that can be used together. How you use it is driven by the strategy, and as you've noted, that's where the void in the conversation is.
The center here.
Well, I want to thank the panel for their discussion, and you've addressed U.S. civil-military relations, but we haven't addressed much in terms of Chinese civil-military relations. And having had some intense dinners with senior People's Liberation Army political commissars, I'm not sure they're as sanguine that we've got the Taiwan problem under control. They still are vociferous about their need to develop capabilities to ensure, should Taiwan ever cross a red line, that they can perform their mission to force reunification. And so until, without addressing that, I'm not sure how we get at the military dynamic, and also to the extent the People's Liberation Army is another political constituency and an independent, somewhat independent actor of the central authority, I'm not sure how diplomacy working with the central government actually working through the process translates into what the PLA purchases for what purpose. Any thoughts you have on that, I'd appreciate it. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm John Hanley. I'm just an interested citizen.
You're right that there are strong views in the PLA about the Taiwan issue, and I have spent many hours with PLA generals, both active and retired, discussing the issue, both in an official capacity with the American government and in a private capacity since I retired. The PLA does believe that it needs to have the capability to prevent a separation of Taiwan from China. At the moment, that is not a credible possibility. The PLA has been using the Taiwan issue as a budget driver. And unfortunately, recent developments in the cross-strait relationship have been so positive in the sense that they have greatly expanded economic cooperative ties. If you visited Xiamen, which is the big Chinese city right opposite Taiwan, it's being developed as a tourist resort, not as a jumping-off spot for an invasion. So you need to balance the fact that they consider this an important issue as opposed to viewing it as an issue that justifies high military expenditures on both sides to prepare for potential conflict scenarios. The point I was making is the Taiwan issue is manageable and is understood at the top Chinese levels as being a manageable issue under present circumstances. They don't like our arms sales to Taiwan because they are offensive to China's views of its own sovereignty. But they recognize that our arms sales to Taiwan are not designed to give Taiwan a break-loose capability. If we were acting in that fashion, then the issue would heat up in ways that it is not hot at the moment.
Can I just way in the back there?
Do you want to jump in?
Sorry, I'm going back and forth. I'll get you next.
Yeah, Bill Jones from EIR. I agree essentially with Professor Etzioni and his comments. I think that much of what we have done in the last period, the air-sea battle, the pivot, has sent signals to China which has increased the paranoia over the ultimate intentions of the United States. And President Clinton once said that he was asked what will China be in 20 years. He said it depends on what we do over the next few years together with China, which may determine much of that. And I think we're doing many of the wrong things. But the basic problem, I think, is more on a deeper level. And the thing that presents to me the danger of war more than any particular incident is the trajectory of the present world economy. China seems like it's going up. We seem to be going down. We have somewhat shot ourselves in the foot. China is doing a lot of the things that we used to do in promoting science and technology, and they're being fairly successful with it. But ultimately, you know, we're all in the same boat, and it's not a zero-sum game. But the problem is that our economy is not going in the right direction. We no longer have the capabilities that would be needed to help China resolve some of the problems that Professor Etzioni mentioned in terms of water, in terms of energy over the next few years. And believe me, solar and wind, which is now being discussed over there at the State Department, and climate change, this is not going to help them support 1.3 billion people. We used to have the capabilities of doing that.
Is there a question here?
Well, and if we did that, well, what I'm saying is that the real strategic threat to the United States today is our failure to put the country back on the track of economic growth. We have to do something. We have to reject.
That's a statement. Is there a question there?
Well, no. Okay, then it's a statement. And the statement is that if you want to resolve this crisis, don't get in the foxhole and start thinking about air-sea battle. Go on the offensive and say, how do we bring back progress to the U.S. economy so that we can meet China on an equal level and help them in moving the world forward? I think that's causes the paranoia here where we see China moving forward and whatever we're saying about how we appreciate that, we get pretty scared because we see what's happening to our own economy, our own cities, our own working force. This has to be changed around, and then I think you will create the type of climate of progress in which we can work effectively with China in improving the world economy as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Here.
My name is Brian McGrath. I'm a defense consultant and former naval officer. My question's for you, Professor McCord. Was there no one available who thinks air-sea battle is a damn good idea, should be pursued, and should be implemented vis-a-vis China? Was no one available to sit on this panel today?
I think you said it was. I thought that was.
Vis-a-vis China.
May I?
Sure.
We invited 3 people who are the moving spirits, which we referred to earlier, and they all, after they heard about some of the other panelists, found that they had other commitments.
I'll leave you my business card, so if you do this again, you'll have it.
Well, Brian and I have had this discussion before. It goes back. One of the problems we've had in finding a proponent for air-sea battle, and I've now played in 3 different war games at the Pentagon level, is you say, but what is the strategy? This, okay, we can bomb China, we can do this, we can do that. Okay, why? What are you going to accomplish? We haven't had anyone answer that question. I've had a standing offer for 18 months. Would someone please write a strategy that involves air-sea battle in that role as opposed to in a defensive role to protect Japan without strikes into China? And no one has answered the call. So if you're ready, I'd be happy to do this. Maybe in a piece.
You've told the terms of that debate from the beginning, and at some point we'll have that discussion.
I think we're getting close to the end of this kind of discussion, which I very much hope for, and I hope we carry it beyond this room. But I want to add a prediction, and that's in social science by far the most risky business. And that is that, again, the history will turn differently than the scenarios we discussed so far lead us to expect, because the pivot is going to force us to return to the Middle East, not only because developments in Iran and obvious ones in the other parts of the Middle East, and the nuclear weapons in Pakistan, which accelerates its nuclear military program, but because there is a deep connection between the Middle East and the Far East, which is not often enough mentioned. If you are a Vietnamese, a Philippine, or Japanese, and you see that after we 7 times retracted our red lines for Iran, after we announced again and again it's unacceptable that they will have a nuclear weapon, and then you wake up Monday morning and say, well, we just decided we don't have to worry about it because we're going to deter them, then you say, I really can't trust these guys too much. And it's my prediction that there's going to be enormous sobering up among our allies in the Far East after we let Iran dominate the Middle East. Check on me.
Okay, that's a whole different debate.
We have to keep the audience interested in coming back. Okay.
And I think that is a good point to bring the conclusion to our discussion today. I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you for